Did you have any involvement with stories about the McCanns?
Yes, I did.
Yes. Did any of those stories result in litigation?
Yes.
Against your paper?
Yes.
And were those stories of similar character to the stories we've seen in the context of the Express, your sister paper?
Yes.
And did you have any involvement in those stories, in particular headlines?
I would have done, yes.
Well, you would have. Well, don't use the conditional. You either did or you didn't.
It depends on what headline we're talking about,
right.
On what day.
So some of them, I think your answer is you were involved in some, but not necessarily all.
Not necessarily all, no.
Right. Why? How did it come about that such defamatory and distressing stories ever found the light of day in your paper?
From memory, the source of the stories was entirely coming from Portugal. We had one reporter out in Portugal covering the story, and we were being fed stories by the Portuguese police and press.
Well, you're being fed them, but that suggests that it was almost an automatic response that you would include them in your paper.
No, not at all. The source of the stories was the Portuguese police and press.
But is this right, that because of the nature of the information, that it was really leaks from the Portuguese police, that your sources couldn't really be checked, could they?
It was very hard to check sources.
Yes. No. So you were running a huge risk, weren't you, in publishing these stories?
Yes, there was a risk, yes.
A risk or a huge risk?
It was a risk, and I, you know, to this day I regret what happened in the McCann case, and I can only repeat the apology we published on page 1, very happily published on page 1 to the McCanns for the hurt and the distress we caused them.
But of course we understand that, Miss Neeson. It's just the thought process at the time that it must have been obvious to you that not merely was there a huge litigation risk, which you called it wrong, but also that the stories were extremely wounding and damaging. Yes, and that not merely had the McCanns physically lost their daughter, she had disappeared, but the accusation was that they were responsible for that. Now, what was your thought process, if any, as to the ramifications of publishing such stories? With
hindsight, as I said, I am deeply sorry for the upset we caused. At the time, I honestly don't recall what my thought process was. It was a story that was a huge story. It was the only story everybody was talking about wherever you went. And the interest was huge, and the stories we were getting were coming from what I thought at the time was a reliable source, i.e. a police force.
But wasn't the guiding factor then the story was of huge interest to your readers?
To everybody.
You knew that the story would have the possibility at least of increasing your sales, and therefore, regardless of its truth, you were going to run it. Is that not fair?
I'm not sure that it did increase sales, to be honest with you. I can't remember the sales figures. We ran the story because it was huge. It was the only story of the day. Nobody else was talking about anything. Wherever you went to the supermarket, people talked about it. It was a huge, huge story. And mistakes were made, for which I am truly sorry.
So it's the size of the story which is the predominant consideration, and also the impact it will have. Is that fair?
Yes, obviously big stories are big stories, yes.